Hey everyone, it's Rob B here with Rob D. We were shocked by the data in this week's episode. This isn't information that's slightly out the norm. It's stuff that pretty much everyone should be talking about in property, but nobody is. The information in this week's episode is incredible.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. This is the part of the week where we take some time out from advising a multi-million pound property fund and putting together hundreds of transactions for our clients every year and bring you a little bit of what we've learned along the way for free. And like Rob said, we are astonished by what we're going to tell you today, even though we're immersed in this industry all day, every day. What we're about to tell you gave us a whole new perspective on things, and so I'm sure it will for you as well. And do make sure you stick around to the end, because in Hub Extra, Rob is going to share a way that you can be inspired by one of the best in the world.
It's time for our news story of the week, and we have more data for you. It's a data-driven episode this week, and this week's data is about the current state of house prices. Rob, Nationwide, they have an update for us. Where is the market at right now?
Well, it's flat again, according to Nationwide. Headline house prices relatively stable in June. So in May, they were down 0.1%. In June, up 0.1%. Now, June is normally one of the stronger months of the year, so flat may not be as strong as it first appears, but there's loads of really interesting data in the Nationwide release. Lots to dig into here, lots about house prices in general, plenty to say about mortgages, and a whole bunch of other stuff going on as well at the moment. So it's a good thing that our monthly market update episode is coming up next week, because that'll give us a chance to go into the detail of all of it. So do make sure you join us for next Thursday's episode.
And do make sure you check out our exciting new project, Property Hub Select. We are bringing you so much more than we've ever given you before. We've got masterclasses, we've got in-person meetups back again, woohoo, and loads more planned as well. Go to Property Hub Select. This is a service that we're going to be really careful with. And we don't want to just launch this to masses and masses of people at once. So it's our plan to roll it out to just 50 people a month to begin with, and then make sure we've got it right. We want to really control the service of those in-person meetups and the experience. We want the feedback on those masterclasses. We just want it to be the best it can possibly be. So for that reason, Rob, and being a little overwhelmed by all the interest in Property Hub Select, we've decided to limit it to 50 people a month onboarding. And that way we can make sure that Property Hub Select is the absolute best experience it can possibly be.
That's right. So if you'd like to find out more, or you're interested in being among those 50 potentially, then just go to propertyhub.net/select. That's where you can find out more and start the application process. So it's propertyhub.net/select. In property, there are plenty of things that people repeat as received wisdom, and you always assume that they're true, and someone somewhere has fact-checked this claim. And one of the most popular ones of these is house prices double every 10 years. If you've been in property for any length of time, you've probably heard people say this. But is it true? We wanted to find out. So we've gone to the data. We've used Nationwide data, but the land registry data would be pretty similar, I'm sure. And we have an answer. And that answer is absolutely fascinating, because we can use the answer to give us a different perspective on what's happening now and some clues about what might happen in the future as well. So, Rob, I don't think we should tease this out and leave people waiting to the very end for the answer. Does property double every 10 years?
No, is the quick answer. But there's a lot more to it than just the average. The average, to give you the number right now, actually surprised both of us, because it's quicker. It's over a shorter period of time than we both expected. It's just 8.5 years. This is looking at data all the way back from 1952. So basically, after the Second World War had finished, things started to get back to normal and property cycles started to get back to normal. The average time for UK property prices to double has been 8.5 years. You're already probably starting to question, but wait a minute, my property, or property I've seen, hasn't doubled over the last 8.5 years. And you're right, and we'll give you the most recent number shortly. But Rob, we've gone through the data from Nationwide, and 8.5 is the average, but you obviously have a shortest time period and a longest time period. So let's give what the shortest time period has ever been, because it's just even bonkers to think about that property ever doubled this quickly.
Even though I knew this before, I looked it up and I saw it, and I was still astonished to learn that the shortest time that it took for UK house prices to double was 3 years, 1971 to 1974. 3 years, doubling. Now, if you know anything about the early 1970s, you'll know that inflation was the story of that time. So it wasn't just property prices that were doubling very quickly. The price of pretty much everything was doubling very quickly. But nevertheless, when you see it in isolation, it's an astonishing statistic. But the average of 8.5 years is not that meaningful as an average because there's a huge amount of variability around it. So 3 years is the fastest, but there are plenty that are longer as well. There are plenty of 10-year periods where property prices didn't double. And indeed, the longest it's ever taken for UK house prices to double is just over 14 years. And that is from 1989 to 2003. Well, actually, Rob, I said that that's the longest, but that doesn't include what's happening right
now. No, Rob. Because it's not the longest anymore. We have a new longest, everyone. But how long is long? Well, currently, according to Nationwide, house prices, an average house price in the UK is £260,000. So, when was the last time it was 130,000? Because that's half, right? So that's doubling. Well, you are going above 14. 15? No, not there yet. 16? No. 17? 18? 19? No. 20 years. The last time property prices were £130,000 was in 2003. So it's taken 20 years for property prices to double. This, ladies and gentlemen, is by far the longest period of growth for property prices we have ever experienced since the Second World War. And nobody, and not even us until this week, nobody has been talking about it. This, for me, is absolutely massive news. Why is nobody talking about this? We just automatically spout out, oh, property doubles every 10 years. And people hear it, believe it, and accept it. And actually, it's not true. It's 8.5 years. But it's certainly not true at the moment because it's more than the wrong double that everyone gives, which is 10 years. It's 20 and approaching triple of the actual double. I'll stop now. But it's crazy.
It is. I can't believe we didn't know this, given that we do this every day. So clearly no one else does it. It's so counter to what you think. Everyone's under the impression that we've had these runaway house prices over recent decades. And historically, at least, that's just not the case. Now, obviously, over that 20 years, we had a crash about 5 years into it. And you can make data do funny things depending on where you start and stop measuring. But even if you bought at the absolute trough, so you were clever enough to go and buy in the first quarter of 2009, you still wouldn't have had the price of your average property double, even now, 14 years later. So even if you use that time frame, we're still above the previous longest time to double, which was 14 years from 1989 to 2003. And Rob, what's really nuts here for me, which I just had to go and check so many times, I couldn't quite believe it, is that if something doubles in 20 years, then basic maths, that's a compound growth rate of 3.5% per year. But that 3.5% is almost exactly the same as the actual rate of inflation that we've had over the last 20 years. So I went and cross-checked this by looking at the real house price data that Nationwide publishes. And indeed, it turns out that the real house price today, so after adjusting for inflation, is the same today as it was in 2003. So over the last 20 years, house prices have not outpaced inflation. That's just so nuts to think about. I always say that over the very long term, property prices outpace inflation by about 1% per year. So the fact that it hasn't over the last 20 years isn't an astonishing deviation in a historical context, but just based on what we hear so much about how crazy property prices are, that's the surprising part for me. Because actually, in a historical context, the last 20 years have seen poorer performance than usual relative to inflation. It's crazy. If you know anything about our service, Property Hub Invest, it's probably that we secure you exclusive property deals at a discount. But I now make all my investments through Property Hub Invest. And what I value most is actually the time saving and having the care team on hand to deal with developers, mortgage brokers, solicitors, all the things that normally cause so much stress and take up so much headspace. Property investment will never be effortless, but having the expert team at Property Hub Invest makes it so much easier. If you're interested in finding out more about Property Hub Invest, just go to propertyhub.net/invest.
So, if like us, you've been investing over the last 20 years, at this point you might be going, oh, lucky me, I've been operating in the worst market since the Second World War. And yes, you have, but it's not as bad as it sounds, because property is so good, because even in the longest cycle since the Second World War, you can still do very, very well. Because you remember, the reason why this is the worst performing cycle is property historically has outpaced inflation by 1.1% a year. And that doesn't sound a lot, but it really does add up over time. But that's why we bang on about leverage so much and using mortgages as a buy-to-let investor. Because even if property just matched inflation from here on in, and that's all it ever did, it's still an incredible asset. Because with leverage, you can make 3 to 4 times that in capital growth, because most people don't buy all their properties in cash. And even if you buy with cash, you're still being paid a rental income each and every month, which is great. And rent, we know over the long term, matches inflation as well. So you're doing well from a yield perspective, but when you leverage, that's when it gets really powerful, Rob. That's why leverage is an absolute must for long-term property investors.
Exactly. For me, this is such an important point. And obviously, there are risks that need to be controlled when it comes to leverage. The safest thing to do is not to use it. And some of the biggest financial experts in the world push this view. We've spoken in the past on the podcast about Dave Ramsey, absolutely huge financial author and influencer in the US. Says you must buy your properties outright. Don't buy property if you can't afford to buy cash. And he's putting forward that view, I guess partially because he's speaking to a large audience and he's focusing on keeping them safe above everything else. Also because he had bad experiences with leverage in the past and went bankrupt, but that was for short-term renovation projects, so it's not even really the same thing. But I think this point around leverage is so important because it's what transforms property from a bit of a plodder as an investment into something quite exciting. And it means that you can be very happy with a boring decade or two. You don't need property to absolutely explode in value. It's actually better if it doesn't. Because if property radically outpaces inflation, then at some point, as it did in 2008, it's going to revert back to trend and it's going to crash back down again. If all it does is pretty much match inflation, if it could just do that consistently every year, that would be wonderful as an investor because by using leverage, you're making a great return anyway. And I think, Rob, inflation actually holds the key to a lot of this. We did an episode recently about talking about property prices in real terms, which no one ever does. But surely, as we saw, the fastest doubling, 3 years, was when inflation was really high. Inflation over the last 20 years has been relatively low historically, which is why it's taken so long to double. So that might give us some clues about what's going to happen in the future.
It does give us clues. And also previous cycles give us clues as well at what may happen. Because the last longest cycle, which was just over 14 years, as Rob's already said, 89 to 2003, well, that was then followed by the second ever fastest cycle, when inflation was relatively low as well. And when you consider that it was in a low inflation environment, and it still doubled in 5 years, and that was from 2001 to 2006, well, then you go, wow, well, actually, in some respects, that's even more impressive than the 70s 3-year doubling, because that was very, very much inflation driven. But the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is we had a long cycle followed by a very short cycle. We're currently in the longest ever cycle. We have inflation, and history has shown us since the Second World War that longer cycles have been followed by shorter cycles. So does that mean the next doubling is going to be a lot shorter than the 20 years? Well, I don't think you'd have to be brave to say yes, because it probably is going to be shorter. It's just how much shorter. And if you're listening to this as an investor, someone who's been operating in the last 20 years, and until this episode, you thought, well, I actually feel like I've done quite well. Well done you, because as we said, you've been operating in a very sluggish market. But at some point, that will change. It's just when. And of course, we don't know when. And of course, you can't make bets like that to try and time the market and just assume it's going to be a super fast cycle now. It just suggests that the next cycle will be shorter because we have inflation and we have had a very long cycle and it's taken a long time to double. It's going to be really interesting, Rob, the next few years for property. We're going to be talking about the 18-year property cycle again in the next few weeks, because I think that's really important to look at and address. And I'm sure a few of you are thinking about that already with this data in mind. And we also have to discuss this house price crash that people have talked about, because we have some interesting views on that. To be honest, we could easily roll for the next 5 hours because we've got so much we want to talk about around this data, around what's happening. because there's so much happening in the market right now. And I feel that just being operating at surface level and not really digging into what's happening isn't going to serve you well as an investor. But Rob, as we've shown here, just a little bit of digging reveals the most fascinating information, and information that you can then use as a property investor.
Yeah, exactly. It's such a useful perspective because none of this is to deny what's happening in the market right now. Like house prices are falling a bit at the moment, and there are lots of very obvious challenges to investing, which you will be reading about everywhere. But I think going to the data, which is reality, and taking a long-term perspective as we have here, it's just so relaxing. I find it relaxing because it pulls you out of the drama that's happening now and the speculation about what's going to happen in the immediate future, and pulls you back to, well, what's the point of all this in the first place? So for me, this is super powerful stuff, and I'm really excited by some of the episodes that we've got coming up over the next few weeks.
So make sure you are subscribed to the Property Podcast. We know most of you are, so thank you. But if you're not, you don't want to miss out on July. July is one of the strongest months for content we're ever going to produce. There's so much that we're desperate to talk about. And make sure you share the podcast. The only way podcasts grow is through word of mouth. That's how podcasts work. So please do let other people know. Share episodes like this and the rest that are coming up over the next few weeks, because you're massively going to help those people. And then, of course, you help grow the pod as well, which is great because we'll appear further up the charts and hopefully more people find us again. So share this to help us and help others around you, because this information can really change your view as a property investor. And like Rob said, just make you a little calmer. Yes, this is the longest property's ever taken to double, as we've all just found out. But if this is the worst and we've all been operating quite well, then yeah, well done us. We can operate successfully in the slowest ever market. So imagine how we'll all perform when things speed up.
Okay, well, let's move on to Hub Extra. And after spending a lot of time combing through data and looking at graphs, you need a bit of relaxation. And Rob, you've been turning to Netflix for that. And you've watched something that's high up on my list and I'm really looking forward to getting into. What is it?
It's Arnold. I'll stop. I won't do any more. But Arnold on Netflix is absolutely brilliant. It was on my list to watch, and producer Dan gave me a nudge to watch it. I'm so glad he did, because this is epic, right? His book, his autobiography, Total Recall, is absolutely brilliant. A must read for all podcast listeners. Most people think he made his money through his films and all the blockbusters he did, or maybe his bodybuilding. But actually, Arnold made his money through property. He became a millionaire through property. And that is something that's not often discussed, and it is covered in his book and a little bit in Arnold as well. But the TV series is just so well done. It's only over 3 parts, but it's absolutely brilliant. He's on top form when he does this. It's so well produced, and you can't help but be inspired. I find him actually very relatable. He seems to be one of those people who lives in the future, and my head's always in the future as well, and what is possible. And if you are minded that way, I think it's really useful, because you are always visualizing what can be and what success could be, and then you work towards it. You set a vision. He talks about visions being more powerful than goals, and it's something I can really relate to. But if you're not that way inclined, watch it, because hopefully it will then start to make you think about that as a habit, and you'll then develop your own vision for the future, and a passionate vision that you can then work towards. He is a big believer of dream it, do it. If you dream it up, visualize it, and then go ahead and achieve it. Remember, this guy's from a sleepy village in Austria. He was not at all wealthy. He didn't have the internet to break out. He didn't have TikTok to make him famous. He had to work his way up from the small village to the local cities, to moving to Germany, to moving to London, and eventually to the US, changing career disciplines multiple times, dominating in pretty much every discipline he ever took on. The guy has been incredibly successful. Of course, he has his flaws, like we all do. We're all human. But my God, this man is an inspiration. And what he's packed into one lifetime is incredible. So if you want to be inspired, then watch Arnold. It's a cracker.
Well, there's a pitch for you. You're welcome, Netflix. And if you're more of a reader than a watcher, then the book is incredible. It's one of my all-time favourites. But that is us done for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. We do have great episodes coming up, so do make sure you're following on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen, so those episodes magically show up on your device. And make sure you're subscribed to our free weekly newsletter, Property Pulse, so all the biggest property news finds its way magically into your inbox for free every Friday. Just go to propertyhub.net/pulse, and we will see you back here next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.